Sit with me for a moment. The rectory is quiet tonight, and the only light comes from the flicker of these beeswax candles, reflecting off the worn leather cover of this old Latin Bible resting on my desk. Listen to the silence of this room. It is a heavy, expectant silence. My name is Father James Sullivan. For 50 years, I have worn this stiff white collar, stood at the altar, and sat in the deep, suffocating darkness of the confessional box. Over half a century, I have heard the whispered sins of soldiers, the quiet despair of mothers whose hearts were breaking in secret, and the hidden agonies of proud men who thought they were entirely alone in the brutal machinery of the world. I am 82 years old now, and my bones ache with the dampness of the Boston winters. But more than that, I feel the cold, unmistakable breath of time on my neck. The shadows of the past hold the brightest truths, but we have become a modern people terrified of the dark, preferring the easy light of superficial answers and comfortable illusions. What the pulpit does not tell you, the silence reveals, and the silence of history is deafening if you only know how to listen with the ears of faith. We are running out of time to hear the truth. I am running out of time to speak it. Tonight, I want to take you back through the corridors of 2 millennia to a specific room on a specific night in the spring of the year 33 AD. Let me look into the eyes of history with you. We are going to walk up the limestone steps into the upper room on the night before the crucifixion to uncover the sacred secrets of Holy Thursday and witness the final meal of Jesus Christ. Jerusalem in the spring of 33 AD was not the serene, quiet, holy city of the pastel-colored Sunday school illustrations you grew up with. It was a powder keg, a city trembling violently under the suffocating weight of Roman military occupation and the fervent, almost desperate religious zeal of the Jewish people. It was the week of Passover, the most sacred and ancient festival of the Jewish calendar, commemorating the miraculous liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery centuries before under the leadership of Moses. During a normal, quiet week in antiquity, Jerusalem held perhaps 40 to 50,000 inhabitants. But during the feast of Passover, the ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus tells us that hundreds of thousands of pilgrims flooded through the heavy wooden and iron gates of the city. The narrow, winding streets of white limestone and rough cobblestone were packed shoulder to shoulder with men, women, and children who had traveled from every corner of the known Mediterranean world. Because the city could not possibly house them all, they camped in the surrounding valleys and hillsides, their makeshift tents blanketing the Mount of Olives like a vast sea of white fabric shimmering under the bright Judean moon. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and vibrating with an electric anticipation. If you stood anywhere near the magnificent Temple Mount during that holy week, your human senses would have been completely overwhelmed. The bleating of hundreds of thousands of sheep echoed incessantly off the massive, unyielding stone walls built by the paranoid King Herod the Great. The smell of roasting meat from the countless campfires mixed heavily with the sharp, metallic, unmistakable scent of fresh blood. According to historical records and archaeological evidence from the period of the Second Temple, the sheer volume of animal sacrifices required for the Passover festival meant that the blood from the slaughtered, unblemished lambs literally flowed out of the temple complex through specialized, engineered drainage pipes. This river of sacrifice spilled down the steep hillside into the Kidron Valley, turning the small brook running through it into a literal stream of red. It was a massive, highly organized industry of sacrifice, a physical, visceral, and terrifying reminder to every soul present that sin required a severe payment and that freedom from bondage was always purchased with blood. Looming above all this frantic religious fervor was the cold iron shadow of the Roman Empire. The formidable Antonia Fortress, positioned directly adjacent to the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, housed the heavily armed Roman garrison. During the volatile season of Passover, the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, a man known for his brutal efficiency and utter contempt for Jewish customs, would travel from his comfortable coastal palace in Caesarea Maritima to the claustrophobic heat of Jerusalem, bringing heavy military reinforcements with him. The Roman legionaries stood on the elevated colonnades, their bronze armor gleaming in the sun, looking down at the massive, swirling crowds of worshippers, their hands resting nervously on the leather-wrapped hilts of their short swords. They were absolutely terrified of a riot. The Zealots, a faction of Jewish insurgents who wanted to overthrow Rome by violent force, frequently used the dense crowds of the festival to carry out assassinations with hidden daggers, melting back into the throng. The atmosphere in the Holy City was one of extreme paranoia, feverish religious ecstasy, and political terror. It was into this exact, uncompromising crucible, this volatile intersection of divine expectation and human violence, that Jesus of Nazareth chose to walk. Imagine, if you can bear it, the psychological and spiritual state of Jesus on that Thursday evening as the sun began to dip below the horizon. For 3 exhausting years he had walked the dusty roads of Galilee and Judea, healing the sick who clawed at his garments, and speaking with a sovereign authority that utterly terrified the entrenched religious elite. But now the journey was abruptly ending. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He possessed the terrifying clarity of divine foreknowledge combined with the fragile vulnerability of human flesh. The disciples, those 12 men who had given up everything they knew to follow him, were largely oblivious to the impending catastrophe. As they walked toward the upper room, the gospel accounts tell us they were still bickering and arguing amongst themselves about earthly kingdoms, about which one of them was the greatest, about who would sit at his right and left hand when he established his political throne. They thought the revolution was just beginning. Jesus knew it was ending, or rather, that it was about to be profoundly transformed through a physical and spiritual agony they could not yet begin to comprehend. In the quiet, tense moments before the meal commenced, Jesus carried a psychological isolation that is almost impossible for the human mind to fathom. I have sat in sterile concrete rooms with men on death row hours before their execution, and I have seen the wild terror in their eyes, the desperate physical clinging to the last fleeting moments of life. But Jesus did not merely face a brutal Roman execution, he faced the assumption of the sins of the entire world. He felt the crushing, suffocating weight of every betrayal, every murder, every lie, and every act of unspeakable cruelty ever committed. And sitting right there within arm's reach in that very room was Judas Iscariot, the trusted treasurer of their small group, the man whose imminent kiss in the garden would trigger the avalanche of blood. To sit at a table of intimate fellowship, looking into the eyes of the men you love, knowing with absolute certainty that one of your closest friends has already sold your life to the high priests for 30 pieces of silver, requires a divine endurance that shatters human understanding. This was the hidden, terrifying burden of the cross, a psychological crucifixion that began long before the Roman nails ever pierced his flesh. To truly understand what happened in that stone room, we must deliberately strip away the famous, culturally ingrained paintings of the European Renaissance. Jesus and his disciples did not sit in high-backed wooden chairs lined up on one side of a long rectangular table. In the Greco-Roman and Jewish world of the first century, formal banquets, and especially the solemn Passover Seder, were eaten in a specific arrangement called a triclinium. This was a low, U-shaped table composed of 3 separate sections, surrounded closely by thick cushions resting on the floor. The guests did not sit upright. They reclined on their sides on the floor, leaning heavily on their left elbows, eating and passing food with their right hands. Their feet were stretched out behind them, radiating away from the low table. This specific posture of reclining was not merely a matter of ancient comfort. It was a profound, highly regulated cultural and theological symbol. In the harsh reality of the ancient world, slaves stood to eat their meager, hurried meals. Only free men, masters of their own destiny, had the luxury and the legal right to recline at a banquet. By explicitly choosing to recline at the Passover meal, the Jewish people were physically acting out their identity as a liberated people. They were declaring through their bodily posture that they were no longer slaves breaking their backs under the whips of Pharaoh in Egypt, but free men dining as royalty in the presence of their God. The lighting in the upper room would have been dim and atmospheric, provided by small clay oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows against the rough limestone walls. The air in the enclosed space would have been thick and fragrant, smelling intensely of burning olive oil, roasted lamb, the sharp tang of bitter herbs, and the sweet aroma of fermented wine mixed with water. The Passover meal itself was not a casual gathering of friends. It was an intricate, highly structured ritual, a sacred liturgy that had been meticulously passed down from father to son for over a millennium. The table would have been carefully set with deeply symbolic elements mandated by the Torah and rabbinic tradition. There were the bitter herbs, the maror, specifically meant to burn the mouth and bring physical tears to the eyes, to make the participants vividly remember the bitter tears of slavery in the brickyards of Egypt. There was the charoseh, a thick, sweet, textured paste made of crushed apples and walnuts, which visually resembled the clay mortar the Israelite slaves were forced to use to build the massive store cities. There was the unleavened bread, the matzah, flat, pierced, and hard, known as the bread of affliction, baked in frantic haste before the dough could rise on the terrifying night of the Exodus. And central to the entire structure of the evening were the 4 cups of wine. Each cup was poured, blessed, and consumed at very specific, unalterable moments in the ritual. Each cup represented a distinct, powerful promise God made to Moses in the book of Exodus. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and I will take you as my people. Every precise movement of the hands, every taste on the tongue, every chanted prayer was a physical act of remembering. But for the Jewish mind, to remember an act of God was not merely to mentally recall a distant past event. It was anamnesis. It was to make that past event spiritually and objectively present. When Jesus took his place at the center of that U-shaped triclinium, the 12 disciples fully expected him to lead them dutifully through the familiar ancient script. They had absolutely no idea he was about to shatter the ritual from the inside out and rewrite the spiritual history of the cosmos. The Gospel of John records that before the main course of the meal fully began, Jesus did something that utterly paralyzed the room with shock. He rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and tied a rough linen towel around his waist. He poured fresh water into a copper basin and, moving from man to man, began to wash the disciples' feet, wiping them dry with the towel. In our modern sanitized world, we completely lose the visceral shock of this moment. In the first century, walking the streets of Jerusalem in open leather sandals meant walking through deep dust, thick mud, and unavoidable animal excrement. Feet were filthy and calloused. Washing another man's feet was a task considered so completely degrading that strict rabbinic law stated a Hebrew slave could not be commanded to do it. It was a job reserved exclusively for the lowest Gentile servants, and yet, here was the rabbi, the Word made flesh, the Son of the living God, stripping down to the undergarments of a slave and kneeling on the hard, cold stone floor in the dirt of his creation's feet. When he reached Simon Peter, the loud, brash fisherman violently recoiled. John registers Peter's horrified refusal. "Lord, do you wash my feet? You shall never wash my feet." Peter's deeply ingrained human pride could not accept a God who served in such a humiliating manner. Peter wanted a conquering warrior king, not a kneeling servant with a dirty towel. But Jesus answered him with a terrifying finality. "If I do not wash you, you have no part in me." This was not just a touching moral lesson in humility. It was a physical, enacted prophecy of exactly what was about to happen on the cross the next day. The God of the universe was willingly stripping himself of his divine glory, getting down into the absolute miserable filth of human sin to wash humanity clean with his own life. As the meal progressed into the night, they reached the critical, agonizing moment of betrayal. The seating arrangement at the Roman triclinium is vital to visualize the intense psychological drama of this moment. The host sat near the center of the U shape, but the position of highest honor was immediately to his left, and the position of intimate, trusted friendship was immediately to his right. The Gospel of John tells us that the beloved disciple John himself was reclining next to Jesus on the right, able to rest his head back against Jesus' chest. But based on the physical interactions described in the biblical text, Judas Iscariot had to be in the seat of highest honor to the left. Because when Jesus was deeply troubled in his spirit and testified aloud to the room, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me," he whispered it to John, and then, as a gesture of profound grace, Jesus dipped a morsel of the unleavened bread into the bitter herbs and handed it directly to Judas. In the Middle Eastern culture of that time, for the host of a banquet to dip a piece of bread and personally feed it to a guest was a mark of supreme favor and intimate friendship. Even at the absolute precipice of his treason, even knowing the soldiers were waiting, Jesus offered Judas a profound gesture of unmerited love. He was giving his betrayer one last desperate chance to look into his eyes and turn back from the abyss. But Judas took the morsel, his heart hardened by greed and disappointment, and the Gospel of John delivers one of the most chilling, devastating sentences in all of human literature. "So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. And it was night." Judas physically left the light of the world and walked willingly into the eternal darkness. The heavy wooden door closed behind him, and the silence that descended upon the remaining 11 men in that room must have been heavier than lead. It was in this incredibly intimate, deeply wounded atmosphere, with the betrayer gone into the dark and the shadows of the impending crucifixion deepening, that Jesus took the ancient Passover ritual and transformed it forever. He took the unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. For over 1,000 years, the father of the Jewish household had held up this specific bread and said the traditional words, "This is the bread of affliction which our fathers ate in the land of Egypt." But Jesus did not say those words. Matthew writes that Jesus blessed it, broke it with his hands, gave it to the disciples, and said something that shattered their theology. "Take, eat, this is my body." And then, later in the meal, he took the cup of wine. According to the structure of the Seder, this was the third cup, known as the cup of redemption. He gave thanks, passed it to them, and said, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." I want you to pause and truly understand the magnitude of the theological earthquake that just occurred. In ancient Judaism, the drinking of blood was universally forbidden by the law of Moses, under penalty of being cut off from the people. Blood was considered the sacred essence of life, reserved exclusively for the bronze altar of the temple to make atonement. For a Jewish rabbi to command his followers to drink his blood was scandalous, unthinkable, and borderline blasphemous. Unless, of course, he was instituting a completely new, transcendent reality. By speaking these words, Jesus was emphatically declaring that the blood of millions of sheep sacrificed in the Jerusalem temple over the centuries had never truly, permanently taken away human sin. They were merely pale shadows pointing to this definitive moment. He was revealing himself as the true ultimate Passover lamb. His physical body would be brutally broken on the cross, just as the bread was broken by his hands on the table. His blood would be poured out onto the dirt of Golgotha to secure an eternal liberation from sin and death. By commanding them to eat and drink, he was physically internalizing the grace of the cross, forging an unbreakable eternal bond of flesh and spirit between the infinite Creator and the finite creature. This astonishing claim did not happen in a historical or theological vacuum. It was the precise fulfillment of the architectural blueprint God had meticulously laid out in the archives of the Old Testament. Any devout Jew reclining in that room would have felt the ancient echoes of the prophets reverberating off the stone walls. Go back in your mind to the book of Exodus, chapter 12. On the terrifying night of the first Passover in Egypt, God commanded the Israelites to take an unblemished male lamb, sacrifice it, and paint its blood on the wooden doorposts of their homes. The angel of death would see the blood and pass over that house. But killing the lamb was not enough to save them. God explicitly commanded that they had to roast and eat the flesh of the lamb that very night. The sacrifice was only complete when it was consumed by the faithful. Jesus, in the upper room, was revealing himself as the unblemished Lamb of God. Tomorrow afternoon, his blood would be painted on the wooden doorposts of the cross. But tonight, before the blood was shed, he was miraculously providing his flesh to be eaten, completing the liturgy of the new and greater Exodus. We must also look to the searing words of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote 700 years before this night. In Isaiah chapter 53, the prophet spoke mysteriously of a suffering servant, writing, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter." Jesus knew perfectly that he was walking directly into the teeth of this ancient prophecy. He was embracing the slaughter not as a helpless victim of circumstance, but as a sovereign king stepping deliberately onto a cosmic battlefield to defeat death by dying. And perhaps most powerfully of all, we must look to the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 31, the Lord declares, "Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel." When Jesus held up the heavy cup of wine and said, "This is my blood of the new covenant," he was deliberately invoking Jeremiah. The old covenant was carved on cold tablets of stone at Mount Sinai. The new covenant would be infused into the living blood of Christ and written permanently on the human heart by the fire of the Holy Spirit. The theological depth of what transpired in that upper room is a vast, bottomless ocean. The Apostle Paul, a former Pharisee writing in his first letter to the Corinthians, provides our earliest written account of this night. Paul writes, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" I need you to pay close attention to the language here. The specific Greek word Paul uses for the word remembrance is anamnesis. In our modern English language, to remember means to merely think about something that is gone. But in the biblical Greek, anamnesis carries a profound active power. It means to make a past historical event objectively, truly present in the here and now. When Jesus commanded his apostles to do this in anamnesis of him, he was granting them the staggering divine authority to pull the eternal, once-for-all sacrifice of Calvary out of the first century and place it present and bleeding on the altars of churches across all of time and space. This is the very core of the mystery of transubstantiation, the profound, unyielding Catholic truth that the simple elements of wheat bread and fermented grape wine do not merely symbolize Christ, but truly, miraculously become his body, blood, soul, and divinity. This leads us directly to the staggering theological concept of kenosis, a term used by Paul referring to the absolute self-emptying of the Son of God. Christ, the eternal Logos who holds the burning galaxies together by the sheer word of his power, allowed himself to be condensed, to become utterly small and vulnerable in the fragile elements of the Eucharist. It is the ultimate act of propitiation, the satisfying of divine justice through an act of infinite, incomprehensible mercy. We arrogant humans have spent thousands of years trying to reach up to God by building massive towers of pride. God shattered our arrogance by reaching down to us, by becoming a piece of bread held in the rough, trembling hands of a fisherman. The Eucharist instituted on Holy Thursday tells us that God does not want to be a distant tyrant issuing cold commandments. He wants to enter into the very marrow of our bones. He wants to be our daily sustenance, offering himself completely, holding nothing back, making himself utterly vulnerable to our acceptance or our cruel rejection. I want you to stop and think about your own life for a moment. The long, dark hours in the confessional have taught me one undeniable truth. We all carry a deep, quiet, agonizing starvation within us. We try desperately to feed our starving souls with money, social approval, and fleeting physical pleasures. But these things are like drinking salt water when you are dying of thirst. They only increase the burning, and they leave us emptier than before. Look at Jesus at that low table in the upper room. He knew with divine certainty that he was about to be abandoned by every single man in that room, save young John. He knew the agonizing pain of the Roman scourging pillar was only hours away. Yet his mind, his heart, his entire focus was fixed on feeding them, on providing a miraculous way to stay physically and spiritually present with them until the end of the world. I want you to think of one specific person in your life right now. Perhaps a son or a daughter who has walked away from the faith of their childhood. A friend who is quietly drowning in the shallow waters of our modern culture, or someone you know who is deeply, silently hurting and needs desperately to know that they are fiercely, passionately loved by a God who gets down in the dirt to serve. Share this video with them. Send them this confession from an old priest. Let them hear the truth that the pulpit often misses. And if you have found truth in the shadows with me tonight, subscribe to this channel. My name is Father James Sullivan, and my final mission on this earth is to reveal what has been guarded in the silence before the precious time we have left finally runs out. May the peace of Christ, a peace which completely surpasses all human understanding, guard your hearts and your minds in the days to come. Go in peace.